Hi everyone! This video is a little bit different than usual. For my final American history project, I decided to make a YouTube video on it. I will be drawing a scene from the Cold War. I am going to talk about the Cold War in this video and also talk about what I am drawing to represent it. For this scene, I'm drawing a bomb/fallout shelter that was used during the Cold War, which I will get into later. First, I'll briefly go through some basic information on it. President Franklin D Roosevelt arranged a conference for the world's nations other than those of the Axis. It was held at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire and created many economic institutions that are still in use. The International Monetary Fund, a new currency system, and many others were all set up at Bretton Woods. After creating a new global economic system, the Bretton Woods system, he wanted to set up a new political system to prevent another world war. He thought that the U.S. staying out of the League of Nations helped cause World War II, so he wanted to create a new international organization. The United Nations was created in 1944 at the Dumbarton Oaks Estate in Washington, D.C. The National Security Council was created in the United Nations, which gave each country in the National Security Council veto power. The countries in the National Security Council were the great powers that had helped to defeat the Axis, forcing them to work together each time that the UN took action. Soon afterward, Germany was divided into 4 zones and was forced to pay heavy war reparations. Tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union increased after disputing about Germany's payments. Once the war officially ended, Soviet leaders wanted to keep Germany weak and make sure that the countries between them were under control. They believed Vladimir Lenin's theory about capitalistic nations attempting to overthrow communism. President Roosevelt died not long after, and President Harry S. Truman took control. He was very anti-communist and thought that World War II had started since Britain tried to appease Hitler and did not want to do the same thing with Joseph Stalin, the USSR's fascist dictator. Unlike Stalin, Truman did not believe that Germany would have to pay such heavy war reparations and that they needed some time to recover. Truman offered Stalin some industrial equipment and several other proposals to get Stalin to accept, but he didn't like them. Truman knew about the new atomic bombs that the U.S. had access to and gave Stalin a hint about them. Stalin thought that the reason the U.S. wanted to limit reparations was because they wanted to keep the Soviet weak. He had to accept the proposals anyway, or else the Soviets couldn't get the reparations from Germany. The Soviet army in Eastern Europe assured that communist governments would be installed in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Those countries began being called satellite nations since they were controlled by the USSR. Even though they weren't directly under their control, they had to stay communist and friendly to them. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill said that it was like an iron curtain falling over Eastern Europe, separating it from Western Europe. The U.S. was getting angry about the Soviets not cooperating, so the American embassy in Moscow was asked about the cause of their behavior. George Kennan explained that the Soviets' view of the world was coming from their quote-unquote Russian sense of insecurity, and communist ideas pushed by Lenin and Stalin caused their fear of the West. He explained that it would be impossible to make any non-temporary agreement with them. He proposed containment of Russian expansive behaviors. If the U.S. could keep the USSR from expanding their powers, they could defeat communism, and they wouldn't even have to go through the struggles of war. Post-war Western Europe was facing many troubles, so George C. Marshall suggested the European Recovery Program, or the Marshall Plan. It would give different European nations support from America, which would help to rebuild their economies. It was offered to the Soviet Union, but they rejected it and instead created their own program. It separated Europe into even more small competing regions. The Marshall Plan gave many supplies to countries in Western Europe, and it weakened communism interest. Germany was divided into Western Germany, which convinced the Soviets that they wouldn't get their desired reparations. Truman sent bombers that were able to carry atomic weapons to Berlin to avoid war with the USSR. Stalin eventually removed the blockade, and it showed the United States' determination to not give in to communism and the Soviets. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created, and it didn't include Western Germany in it until 6 years later, which alarmed the Soviets. They decided to create the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance in Eastern Europe. China eventually fell to communism and signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviets, who just recently announced that they had tested their first atomic weapon. The United Nations troops were beginning to advance, so the People's Republic of China saw it as a threat, telling them to stop their advance. When they ignored the warnings, Chinese troops drove the UN forces backwards. Douglas MacArthur was furious about this, demanding that the war be expanded against China, a blockade of Chinese ports, and the use of atomic bombs in Chinese cities. President Truman denied MacArthur's demands since he didn't want to expand the war nor use any atomic weapons. MacArthur replied saying that, quote-unquote, there is no substitution for victory, meaning that if the U.S. was going to win, they should use everything they've got in order to make it happen. Truman then fired MacArthur for insubordination. The Korean War, which was going on at the time, significantly changed the United States' tactics in the Cold War. Before 1950, the U.S. had usually used political pressure and economic aid as their strategy to contain communism. Once the Korean War began, they began using their military more often. Now I will go into more depth about the lesson I am doing this project on. In the 1950s, there were many rumors that the communists were planning to take over the entire world. The Red Scare first started in 1945 when Igor Gouzenko defected the Soviet Union. He informed the U.S. of the Soviets planning to infiltrate different government agencies in the U.S. and Canada. He said that this was because the Soviets were trying to gain information about the atomic bomb that currently only the U.S. had the information or the access to. They began searching for spies, which quickly intensified the fear of communist subversion. In 1947, Truman created a loyalty review program to find any spies, and it confirmed that the government was infiltrated by communists. Over 6 million federal employees were screened for loyalty between 1947 and 1951. Most of the reasons that people were screened for were very unnecessary: reading a specific book, watching a certain movie, belonging to a particular group, etc. About 2,000 people quit their jobs under pressure, and some 212 were fired because of quote-unquote questionable loyalty with no real evidence. The FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, wasn't satisfied enough. He asked the House Un-American Activities Committee, or the HUAC, to have public notices on communist subversion, so not only communists, but also communist sympathizers would also be exposed. Many groups suspected of subversion were infiltrated, and thousands of telephones were wiretapped. One of their first announcements was on films, for any movies that might subtly support communist ideas or ideals. Ronald Reagan, who is currently the head of the Screen Actors Guild, said that there were communists in Hollywood. Producers agreed not to hire anyone who was suspected of being a communist. Former communist Whittaker Chambers told the HUAC of some government officials who used to be communists or spies. One was diplomat Alger Hiss, who denied both being a communist and a spy, but also denied ever knowing Chambers, which is obviously false. The investigation was ready to be dropped, but Richard Nixon convinced them to keep trying to determine the liar. Chambers showed them copies of secret documents, which exposed Hiss. There were several other spy cases, which each proved the suspected spy guilty. Many government schools, businesses, churches, and unions began trying to find and expose communists. Many of them required people to take oaths and fired anybody who refused. The Red Scare spread even more once the Soviet Union had successfully tested their atomic bomb and when China fell to communism. And many Americans believed that the U.S. was losing the war. Senator Joseph R. McCarthy gave a speech saying that he had a list of 205 communists that were known to the Secretary of State and were developing the State Department with communist ideals. McCarthy said that he would gladly show his list to the Associated Press, but they were stuck on his plane, but it never arrived, and he continued making charges. Congress passed the Internal Security Act, also known as the McCarran Act, which made trying to create a totalitarian government illegal. It also made it so all communist-related organizations would have to issue their records and register with the U.S. Attorney General. Communists would not have passports and could easily be arrested or detained during a national emergency. Truman vetoed the bill since he did not want to punish people simply because of their opinions, but the veto was overridden by Congress in 1950. McCarthy became the chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Investigations in 1953. It forced government officials to testify about supposed communist influences, which quickly became witch hunts. This became known as Mccarthyism. He was often on headlines, accusing people of the littlest things and refusing to accept their answers. He began looking for spies in the U.S. Army, where many of his hearings were televised. People were watching him harass officers about unimportant things, and he became less and less popular. McCarthy brought up a young lawyer in Joseph Welch's firm who used to be a communist to him, and Welch started yelling at him for possibly ruining his career and asked if he had any sense of decency, what the public had been afraid to say for a long time. The Senate soon passed a vote of censure against McCarthy, who died just a few years later. The Soviet Union successfully tested the most powerful hydrogen bomb, also called the H-bomb, less than a year later than the U.S. had in 1953. The U.S. started preparing for a surprise attack. Schools held duck and cover drills to protect themselves from a bomb, though it didn't change anything except make people feel safer. Although many people died immediately by a nuclear blast, many more would die later from burns and radiations or fallout. Many people built fallout shelters to protect themselves from this, which I will get into further later. All of the worries brought by the Cold War also brought new ideas for books, films, plays, and more. There are many new movies about people who were secret spies for the Soviets, FBI activities and spy cases, and anything else you could think of. These show how all the craziness during a war can lead to people getting the wrong idea of the enemy. While all this hysteria about communist infiltration, the possibility of a nuclear war, and McCarthyism were combined with the optimism and prosperity of post-war America. The 1950s were considered a very weird time because of the crazy and happy mix. All America needed was for something to make them more secure during this crazy time. Now I'll talk about some of the things that I featured in the drawing of a fallout shelter. You can see that it's not very comfy or cozy at all, just a few hard benches and 2 small beds. This is a family of 3, a father, a mother, and a young girl. There is a cabinet that holds all of their necessities, such as food and water, which are in the boxes, utensils and cutlery, and some other random junk that they keep in there. There are no windows since it's underground, and the only ways to hear what's going on in the outside world are through radios and newspapers. The father is reading a newspaper while the mother is turning on the radio, and the child is sitting on top of the bunk bed, worriedly listening to what's coming from the radio. The time I set this in is from the 1950s, so I tried to give the family clothing and hairstyles from that time. I also tried to make the radio look like it was one from the 1950s. None of them have a very happy expression since it was such a stressful and scary time. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and maybe learned something new. Have a great day!